And we're just letting everybody come in, and then we'll get started. It's nice to see some familiar names. Okay, it's 10:01. So we'll go ahead and get started now and let people come in throughout the introductory section. So to start with, just to say hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the Centre for Child Protection's Critical Conversations in Child Protection webinar series. It is our second season, which we're delighted to be hosting again. The objective of this series is really to promote the latest research, practice knowledge, theory, and lived experiences around safeguarding children. It's for multi-professional groups of child protection professionals, including health, education, police, social work, third sector organizations, and more. I'm hoping this is all of you who are in attendance today. The Centre aims to get to the heart of child protection training using innovative ideas, as can be seen in our multi-award-winning public impact and engagement and research portfolio. So we offer a couple of things. First of all, we offer CPD certified training sessions using interactive and engaging child protection simulations, looking at developing an understanding of exploitation, radicalization of children, as well as neglect, courtroom skills, sexual abuse, and more. We also deliver a postgraduate program in advanced child protection, including a master's, a postgraduate diploma, postgraduate certificate, standalone modules, and PhD routes as well, which are all for multidisciplinary child protection professionals. They're part-time and they're offered through a distance learning approach. So most of our students study alongside full-time work, and distance really doesn't matter. We're recruiting now, and the closing date for applications is the 1st of December for our January 2024 start. And finally, I wanted to let you know about our MOOC, or it's called a Massive Open Online Course. It's focused on communication skills when working with vulnerable children. This is free and it starts on the 6th of November. So register now. And we will be putting links into the chat for all of these topics in a second if they're not there already. So before I introduce the main event, just a couple of traditional housekeeping notes. Please be aware that we are recording this for a time-limited public distribution. Your videos and your microphones are disabled for a few reasons, but basically this is just to ensure a smooth, easy to hear GDPR sensitive experience for everybody. The chat feature is enabled, and we want you to have conversations with each other. We want to encourage those discussions, and we really are hoping you're going to present our guest speaker, Dr. Rachel Larkin, with some really good questions for afterwards. A few notes. Again, the chat is not recorded, so please use this freely and chat away with each other, ask the questions that you want to ask. However, please do so responsibly and respectfully of others. The presenter, Dr. Rachel Larkin, will not be able to read or respond to the chat. However, we do have colleagues monitoring that chat who will answer non-specialist questions, and they'll be able to pull out questions for the presenter, which will be reserved for the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session. So please make use of that valuable opportunity and use it to ask Rachel all these great questions. Now, we will try to get to all of the questions as much as possible, but if we run out of time, please, if it's anything urgent, contact us separately. And also a common question asked is about PowerPoint slides. We will be sharing these on our website in due course. Finally, please join us on social media. You can tweet about the event by following @UniKentCCP or #CriticalConversationsCP. All right, so without any more, let's introduce our main event. We're joined today by Dr. Rachel Larkin, and she is a lecturer at the University of Kent with over 25 years of experience in social work practice. She's worked in a large range of children and family services in both voluntary and statutory sectors. She's got a broad research interests in social work with children and families. However, she's particularly interested in social work's role with people affected by asylum and immigration systems, and practice with young people who are trafficked and or experience forms of exploitation. Rachel has an interest in practice near research and creative methodologies as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to you, Rachel. And again, I just now want to thank you for talking to us. And again, looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So as Tracy said, today I'm going to be taking us through some thoughts around safeguarding separated young migrants. I'll come on and say a little bit about who that is, because we know there are many terms involved when we're thinking about people who cross borders. I always start with this picture, really as a reminder that we as human beings have crossed borders, have migrated, moved across the planet ever since we've existed. So this is not, migration is not a new thing for us as humans. And our ideas about who we want to cross borders, we lionize people like Christopher Columbus, don't we? So sometimes people who cross borders are really seen as heroic figures, and other times they're seen as unwanted people. So it's really just a reminder that our ideas about this topic has always been with us and that it changes over time. So thank you for that kind of introduction, Tracy. Just to say that I'm speaking as somebody who has an academic interest, who's carrying out research about social work in particular, but other related professionals, people who are working with young migrants. But I did spend a number of years working with young migrants in social work practice myself. So I'm coming at this very much as a practitioner researcher, so somebody with experience of some of the complexities and the difficulties of working with young people, but also as somebody who's carried out research in that. So that's my positioning to start with. So I'm going to start us by thinking about, okay, what is it like to try and cross a border in the globe currently? And every year there's something called the Passport Index, which is published, which really rates passports in terms of which might be the best passport to have. And by best, it means the passport that is going to enable you to enter the most countries other than your own. So either you can just cross that border or you'll more easily get a visa for that. And the numbers change up and down, but currently in 2022, it's the UAE, United Arab Emirates, which is considered to be the best passport. There's about 190 countries recognised by the UN, and you can get into the majority of those with a UAE passport. If you have a passport from the US or the UK, it's 172, so it's still the majority. Come down to somewhere like Albania, 117. So you can start to see that there are some really stark differences. South Africa is the first African country to appear on the list, 107. I think Nigeria is about 55. And then at the bottom of the list, we have Syria and Afghanistan. So if you hold a Syrian passport or Afghani passport, you can already see that actually your ability to move to cross the globe is very different from somebody who comes from another part of the world. And what does this mean if we think about this globally? Well, if we look at this picture, the blue countries are the countries who would be at the top of that ranking. You can see that they're often countries that have the most wealth, and the countries that are painted brown and red on this map are the countries where people are, where they have more difficulty in crossing national borders and crossing international borders. And the countries in blue, as we know, are spending an enormous amount of money to maintain their borders. Yeah, there's billions and billions and billions of dollars or pounds, however we want to categorize it, spent. We have more fences now in 2023 than we've ever had across the world. And you can also start to see which patterns the people who are tending to experience the most global poverty, inequality, war and conflict are often in the areas where there's brown and red areas. So what does this mean? In 2022, the 5 main countries of origin for forced migrants, so that's people who were considered to be moving because their situation where they live and their place of birth or their place of living has become untenable. And the top 5 countries are Syria, think about the war, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan and Myanmar. We think about the situations that are going on in those countries. And the 5 main host countries are, excuse me, Turkey, which has been a major host country internationally for a number of years, Germany, which has been the main European host country, Pakistan, Uganda, Russia, because of the situation in Ukraine. Now, those countries change. If we look at the UK, in terms of where we sit there, Refugee Council 2023, using UNHCR figures, estimates that we have about 1% of the 27 million people who are forcibly displaced across the world currently. So in terms of who reaches the UK, it's actually a very small percentage globally that happens. You can also see from that there is inequality from the point of birth. Nobody chooses which country they're born into. We arrive in a certain country. So we don't start globally from a level playing field in terms of our ability to move and cross borders. And if we think back to that map, we can also think about the countries which are holding up those borders. The countries that are painted blue on that map are also countries that were very involved in processes of colonialism. And when we look at the research and the literature, it's very clear that actually we're being asked as social workers and related professionals, when we're engaging with people who are using immigration systems, to bear in mind that there is still the impact of colonialism is still seen in the patterns of migration and the patterns of responses today. And research we have here, Giannakopoulos and Lonan talking about the structures of colonialism and practices of control, thinking particularly about offshore situation, think about the plan in the UK to go to Rwanda, example. Are really, you can start to see the patterns of colonialism in those. And the importance for us as professionals when we're responding is that we've also been asked to think about the extent to which services, professional responses, NGO responses, volunteer responses fall into patterns of post-colonialism in terms of seeing this as a white rescue of often people of colour who are crossing borders, and that we can position people very much as charitable subjects. We can start to think in terms of worthiness and deservedness rather than rights. We can see that some lives are considered to be less grievable than others. Dan Feed here is particularly writing about many tens of thousands of people who've drowned in the Mediterranean, and pointing out to us it's not an accident that these are mainly people of colour. So we need to think about ethnicity and race and colonialism when we're engaging with people who cross borders, and we need to be critically reflecting on those issues and asking ourselves in our practice and our responses and our organisational structures, to what extent are we replaying some of these narratives, and what might this mean for the people that we engage with. So we're going to think particularly about children on the move. That's a phrase often we're seeing more and more used by some of the large NGOs. So children who cross borders. And this is an issue for social work and related professionals across the globe. It's not just a UK issue. There are social workers and practitioners struggling with some of the complexities of this right across our planet right now. And the UNHCR estimate that children in 2022 made up about 40% of populations that were displaced. So figures in migration are always positioned. We have to be a bit careful with them. But over a number of years, children show up hugely in populations of forced displacement, usually around 40 to 50%. The UNHCR estimating that there were 43 million children who were living in forced displacement last year in 2022, which is a record number. So the numbers are increasing. 60% of those children were internally displaced. And we know that most people, when their lives become unlivable for a number of reasons, move to other areas within their nation state. But there are still large numbers of children who are crossing international borders. And the UNHCR estimate there were 17 million children who crossed borders last year. And if we look ahead, as we know, climate change is becoming increasingly an issue in our lives. And the estimates are that there could be around over 1 billion people could be at risk of displacement by 2050. So this issue is not an issue that is going away. It's going to be affecting us in terms of people moving, people on the move. It might shift and change the countries that people are moving from. And social work is engaged when we think about children across the globe. It's a really key player, and there are a number of other related professionals, health professionals, police, for example, who are engaged with responses to migrant children globally. So we're really at the centre of this, and so we need to think very carefully about how we're going to position ourselves now and in the future. So bringing it to a UK context, what does this mean? So in 2022, there were just under 6,000 young people considered to be under 18 who applied for asylum in the UK. That's a slight increase in the numbers, but they obviously dipped during the pandemic. We can see that as it's been ever since they were collecting figures, the vast majority of young people who arrive in the UK are young men, believed to be young males, and it's quite a binary gendered position. So there are a very small number of girls, of unaccompanied girls, who reach UK shores, and we'll come on to think a little bit about what that might be. And Afghanistan is the main country of origin for young men in 2022. It's been in the top numbers for a number of years. And Eritrea is the main country of origin for young women. So there are gender differences here we can see in numbers already, in terms of the young migrants who reach the UK, but also in their nationalities. The majority of young women to come from sub-Saharan Africa, we do have some young women from Vietnam. You make it. So we can already see that there are services have developed from work that's been largely done with young men and young men from certain areas. So there might be different nationality pictures from in terms of gender patterns. If we think about who's in the care system and who's considered to be unaccompanied, at the last data collection back in March 2022, there were 5,500 unaccompanied young people. And again, 95% are male, and the majority of young people, as many of us will know, if you're working with young migrants, are older teenagers. So there are young people, younger children who cross borders, but the majority of people who are unaccompanied, travelling alone, are teenagers, and the majority of the UK who reach the UK are male. And obviously there are also care leavers as well, yeah, that have support from local authorities. And there were about 11,500 of those in 2022. So if we consider there are about 82,000 children in the English care system at the moment, it's a significant but not an overwhelming number in terms of the care system. So why do children and young people move? This is a complex issue. I'm just going to run through some of the key reasons. So the one that most people pick out initially, if you ask this question, why do you think young people might move? Community violence and war, yeah, safety. Your life has become very unsafe. You're in a point of conflict. Young people also move because of physical and sexual violence. That might be community-based violence, or it might be violence within their family settings. Forced recruitment, you can start to see some of the gender differences here. So young soldiers, there are more young men who talk about forced recruitment, but there are girl soldiers as well. Sometimes families send away children to try and avoid forced recruitment. Death of family members and reunification. Often young people leave when the carer, the family member that was caring for them, is no longer alive. And because migration happens within families, sometimes often young people are travelling to see somebody else, yeah, an older brother, a cousin, an auntie, or somebody that has already moved, and then they're making a change to go there. Young people can be subject to political and religious persecution. Young women may leave because of forced marriage, female genital mutilation. So we can start to see another gender pattern there. Trafficking is a major issue, as many of us know, and we know that trafficking organisations are very skilled and very clever in terms of promising reunification and jobs. So young people can often be travelling, expecting one thing when actually they're actually being moved for a whole set of other reasons. Economic and educational opportunities. Young people can be sent by family for a number of reasons, economic or because of protection. And sometimes young people can be sold into forms of trafficking when there's global poverty, particularly. Famine and climate change becoming more of an issue. And LGBTQ plus persecution, but we know very little. I'm currently doing some research in this area. But we know very little about sexuality and gender identity, but that is a reason for young people sometimes to move. So there can be a number of reasons why young people might cross a border. You can also see that not all of those things might make you eligible to apply for asylum when you reach a country of origin. And one of the things I'd like to really be clear about is hopes, fears, and aspirations. That when young people may be fleeing a situation or moving on for a situation, but young people travel with a whole range of hopes and fears and aspirations that sustain them. Research continues to show this. This is Grace, a young woman in my research. And we just pull out, she's talking about safety, she's talking about wanting to access education as a young woman, she's talking about ways of expressing her religious identity through her clothing, how she wants to make choices about that. She's talking about wanting to make choices about who she marries, she's talking about a better future, having a voice, having choices. It's really important that we understand the aspirational nature of youth migration and that we engage with that in terms of understanding the reasons young people might move and what might that mean when we meet them as professionals at the border or within services, because it will impact and affect their decisions, their understanding and their hopes. And we need to engage with those things and not blame young people if they're hopeful and aspirational. So there's a number of things we could say about journeys. We've come to know more about journeys, the reason, what happens to young people between the point of departure. And we understand that it isn't a straight line. Journeys can be swift, they can be prolonged, people can go backwards and forwards, they can have points of being static and change. But what is clear is that young people are making strategic decisions at every stage. How can I keep myself safe? How can I move on? How can I get my needs met? They may leave alone, or they may leave from siblings and peers. Some children leave with adults and they become separated on the way, on their journeys. Deliberately, at times there are separations, or sometimes they can become orphaned or parents or carers can be separated by services. We're coming to understand that young people can form some really significant friendships and mutually caring relationships. My research is also showing that young people on the LGBT spectrum can start to create intimate relationships on journeys. And we're often not very good as social workers, I would say, or services at kind of responding to those. We might see family in quite narrow ways. So they might form a significant relationship, but then might be separated when they reach a service or a point of arrival. We know that violence and abuse are commonly reported, and that smugglers and traffickers are often demanding what's known, the phrase is transactional sex at crossings, and borders are very high risk spaces. Migration journeys are hugely risky for children and young people. Huge numbers go, there are concerns and anxieties about the numbers of children who go missing. And we also see that many EU states have now brought in laws against the intentional assistance of someone who's not a national. So in countries around the world, for example, it's illegal to try and help people in the water, to provide them with food, to give them a phone charge, example. So we're seeing states trying to minimise the amount of support and help. So it can become increasingly difficult for young people to access help and support on the way. I mean, social workers can be involved in the separation of children at borders. We could have a whole webinar on this alone. So the picture at the top is the US border, where we know there are a number of children separated from families and lost in some ways within the US care system, and remain lost, remain separated from families. Obviously, there are reasons why that might happen. You know, social workers can be involved separating children, and that can be in their best interest. But we need to think very carefully about, I think, our role at borders and to what extent we are involved in the separation of children, and how parents can be positioned mainly in terms of migration status rather than through in terms of considering their parental abilities in the ways that we would do if they weren't in border spaces. There's a question for us to consider. So it's important that we understand that when children cross borders, they have rights. It's not just about needs, they have rights. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child talks very clearly about, child is seeking refuge, as refugee status, governments must provide them with protection and assistance and protect children from abduction, sale and trafficking. And that they need to ensure that the best interest of the child are primary considerations, so including in immigration processes. So social workers and professionals, we need to think about understanding children's rights position, helping children to engage their rights, to enact their rights as best we can. There are a number of key categories for children. So in order for a child to enact their rights, sometimes part of that process is, well, they need to be identified as a certain group within a certain group in terms of policy and law. Because if you're not considered to be that category of child, then you don't get certain services. So unaccompanied means children under 18 who've been separated from parents. The UNHCR has that category, and that's taken down into national law and policy. Refugee, as I'm sure many of you are aware, really talks about the need to show persecution, particular reasons. And trafficking is the recruitment, transportation of young people using force, fraud or coercion. The boundary between trafficking and smuggling is very blurry, very difficult. Young people themselves are not always sure whether they're being trafficked or smuggling, or they might have some very different ideas to the professionals working around them. It's important to think about that these are global, international definitions. There's a huge number of protocols and laws and guidance internationally about responding to children in these categories. That's then translated into national law and policy in the UK, for example, which comes down into local policy and procedure, local authorities, certain agencies. But those ideas are then reinterpreted at every level and down to that practitioner level. As a practitioner on the front line, you are still reinterpreting this idea of what is a refugee? What does trafficking look like? What do I expect to see when somebody's accompanied or unaccompanied? So it's a reinterpretation. So practitioners are still really, really important. It's important for us to think about how are these things interpreted when it meets the social worker or the other professional who meets the child. And it's that point, the practitioner point, that the young migrant engages with social work services. That's their experience of social work services, is that individual practitioner. So what should we be aiming for? So in relation to the number of children who are crossing borders and the rise in this, UNICEF restated in 2023 what states should be doing. So they're really saying that we should be thinking of of migrant, refugee, displaced children, however we categorise them, as children first and foremost, and creating safe legal pathways and enabling young people to reunite with family. We might ask ourselves to what extent we're achieving that in the UK. I'd suggest that we are struggling certainly to do the second one, safe and legal pathways. We have some schemes, and family reunification is no longer a legal option for children in the UK, as it was when I started in practice. That was entirely possible and seemed to be completely reasonable and in the best interests of children. But that has now changed. UNICEF talking about making sure that children aren't detained, that they're returned, they're not returned without safeguards. And they're asking us to really make sure that we're strengthening child protection and social protection systems to include displaced children without discrimination, treating them as you would treat any other child, and better protecting children on the move. And really importantly, meaningfully engaging with children themselves. What are their voices? Finding solutions that are sustainable and inclusive. So this is the template, if you like. This is a way of us reflecting on, okay, so what are we doing? Do our services meet this criteria? How could we do these things better? And the Global Compact on Refugees talks about the need to provide for refugee children a continuum of protection, care and services from the point that we know they exist right through into adulthood. So we might think about, as we move through this morning, to what extent are we achieving this? Of course, we're living in a political context where at the moment there's a huge political focus on stopping boat crossings into the UK, and that we have a number of laws which I'll come on and mention happening there. So we have to acknowledge the really, really difficult political context we find ourselves in. What that means is that we're presented daily with a number of discourses about people who cross borders and people who are entering the UK and to what extent they're welcome and not welcome. And we're seeing some really different positionings about who's considered innocent and who's considered dangerous and who's considered welcome. This is just an example from the Sun about how some groups of refugees can be positioned as more innocent than other groups of refugees. The importance of that is that it positions refugee children in certain ways. So we have this idea of the refugee child as the innocent, vulnerable, small child in need of protection, possibly quite traumatized child, quite abandoned child in need of rescue. And that sits against the idea of the child as the dangerous stranger, the potential threat. So we see across the globe, children called things like cockroaches, or they seem to bring disease, positioned in a certain way, they're potential terrorists of the future. So we're often presented in the media and in debate and public debate with these kind of two quite polar opposites. The completely vulnerable innocent child or the dangerous stranger on our shores. And the important thing to say is that we in social work and in any other other professions are not living in some hermetically sealed bubble where we're not hearing these narratives and these discourses. And one of the things that comes up clearly in my research is that social workers are taking these things on, whether or not they politically agree with them or agree with them personally. And that it's really important that we as social workers and professionals examine how we're thinking and feeling about young migrants, because that does affect how we respond, the decisions we're making and the assessment processes that we're following. We set up the idea of the grateful refugee, for example. Those are just some quotes from social workers, from practitioners in my research, talking about I was expecting quite a traumatized, shell-shocked young person. I wasn't expecting young people to be as assertive, and really thinking through how that might have affected her practice in terms of the extent to which she believed young people, or got irritated with young people, felt young people weren't grateful enough, and what did that mean in terms of, well, therefore maybe I won't do as much for the young person because they don't feel as grateful. Asking ourselves those questions. And importantly as well, it brings in ideas about worthiness, deservedness, and to what extent are we seeing young people as worthy enough to be an asylum seeker. And these ideas, these thoughts and feelings, the way we construct young people in our head, has an impact on our practice. And so what I suggest is that we need to be critically thinking about that. We need to be asking ourselves and each other and in organisations how we're framing young people. What are the narratives? What are the words we're hearing? Ask ourselves questions about what might that mean for how we respond. As just as an example of this, we see that actually Black young women across the borders can be seen. Research shows us that Black young girls, we come back to that post-colonial legacy, often seen as more sexualized than white girls. So sometimes they're not they're seen as more complicit in terms of exploitation as traffic rather than as survivors. So there's less kind of there's less impetus in order to protect young black girls. Muslim young women can be seen as passive, that they're not for aspirational hopes, that they're being just taken along with the flow. Actually, they are still making decisions and strategic decisions, and they can also be framed as a threat. That certainly came up in my research in terms of seeing young women being seen by carers as a potential threat in the future. So we do need to be wary as well, kind of this idea of we're rescuing young people from oppressive cultures, and that we think much more flexibly and critically about our idea of culture, and that we engage with what culture means for young people themselves. So coming back to the context, particularly of young migrants, and just running through the legislative framework. So obviously in terms of safeguarding, we're often thinking about statutory work, aren't we, which is very much informed by definition, by statute, by law. And we have both the Immigration Act, the Human Rights Act, but the Home Office do have a duty to have regard to the safeguard and welfare of children in all their actions. So that's something we can be, as practitioners outside, if we're outside of the Home Office, engaging with in terms of dialogue with Home Office officials. And really importantly, Children Act 89, it's a kind of fundamental foundational piece of legislation in the UK, is really clear that UK children are entitled to the same care and protection as citizen children. Obviously, there's equivalent legislation in other areas of the UK which says the same thing. So the message is really clear that we need to think in terms of children first, migrants second. Jen Ang here that I'm quoting is an immigration lawyer in Scotland, and she's really keen for us as social workers to hold on to that. We need to be thinking constantly in terms of child and young person first, migrant second. And that's becoming increasingly important because we have some really key pieces of legislation, which we're seeing in the UK, which is really starting to shift how the state is going to be responding to young people as they cross borders. So we're already seeing, as I'm sure you're aware, some changes to having more offshore processing facilities, and it's really not clear how disputed ages are going to be managed within those systems. And we're seeing an increasing centralisation of decision making. So the Home Office is becoming much more involved in decision making for young migrants, particularly at the early stages. And I'll come on and say a little bit more about that. We're seeing some pushing away, which has been part of the huge debate between the Lords and in Parliament, about the extent to which children might be exempt from removal or detention. And we're seeing a kind of backtracking on that and the work that's been done in terms of children not being removed or not being detained, which isn't to say that the Home Office are prioritising those things. We've got the National Transfer Scheme has become mandatory for all local authorities. And one of the key parts of the Nationality and Borders Act, I think is particularly relevant for us as social workers, is the National Age Assessment Board and the decision of the current government to move to more scientific, as they would call it, age assessment. Now, age is a really key issue for anybody who works with young migrants, and it's a very complex and challenging area for us as social workers. Because obviously all these things that I'm talking about protections and seeing you using the Children Act is fine, but you have to be defined as under 18 in order to do that. But trying to define who is a child is actually hugely complex and hugely difficult. But traditionally, over a number of years, globally, age assessment was seen as a means of preventing child detection, ensuring that children are protected. So it was brought in as a way of protecting children. Yeah. And initially, back in 2012, UNHCR talking about age assessment being a measure of last resort, but the need for it to be carried out in a sensitive manner, in a dignified manner. And there's a huge amount of guidance, both nationally in the UK, we've seen over time, and globally about how to do this. And we know there's case law, etc., which informs how age assessment should be carried out. But alongside that, we've also had research which has just consistently indicated that age assessment processes are deeply flawed, that actually they don't do what they pretend to do, or what people would like them to do, which is to define whether somebody's old enough. And this is, I'm sure you're talking about them being sort of imprecise, inaccurate, and inconclusive. And often they can be even more problematic if they start from a point of disbelief. If some services have developed a culture of disbelief, age assessments can be used in quite an excluding way. And so we have increasing calls for social workers to withdraw people saying that age assessments should be stopped. And this is a key issue and a key debate. And there've been, you may have seen some recent debates in community care and in social work discussion groups around this. And we also have, alongside this, a huge kind of raft of every time young people are asked about their experiences of age assessment, they're never positive. Yeah? So young people talk consistently in research about how it feels to be age assessed, about the kind of the emotional impact and the distress that it can cause in terms of having your identity questioned or your nationality questioned or your age questioned. And we know, don't we, that children across borders often just don't know their age, they don't have passports, they don't have documentation. It's a hugely difficult thing for children to prove, even if they do know their own age. This is just a quote from a young man in the Children's Commissioner's report, talking about, again, we're linking us back to that post-colonialism, about how it feels when people are just kind of looking at you and trying to make assumptions about you. And in the UK, we're in the middle of quite a difficult debate, really. So we have had, in 2020, there was a kind of shortened, abbreviated age assessment process, which the government introduced into the Kent intake unit, which was withdrawn as it was considered to be unlawful. But the guidance that went into the Kent intake unit was interesting in the sense that it had primary objective 1 was for social workers to provide opinions on the age, and primary objective 2 was the social work support when they were considered to be immediate welfare concerns. And there were a number of critiques and concerns and questions about the fact that age assessment had been placed before the welfare principle. Yeah, and some questions about whether this was legal in terms of childcare law, in terms of under the Children Act. And what's this done is, I think it's really heightened the debate within social work practice about where are we sitting on age assessments. Are age assessment processes ethical and effective method of protection? If we start with the idea that, yes, we do need to protect children from adults being in children's services, and there are many people who would argue that, are age assessments actually going to be able to do that for us? And there's some increasing questions with the medicalisation of age assessments, moving away from the social framework, which has been more recently in use in the UK. What about young migrants consenting to medical tests? We don't really know at this stage. If you don't consent, are you automatically then put into the adult category? What's going to happen if young migrants consent? We have a number of legal challenges on the way about that. So there's some ethical debates around that. What role should we play? And we now have even our organisation, so BASWA, who initially wrote a lot of guidance about age assessment, were quite involved in the development of those, have this year put out a statement saying, we think we're discouraging social workers or discouraging members of BASWA, as well as other social workers, for applying for taking up age assessment roles in the National Age Assessment Board because of concerns of the politicisation of the age assessment process. So we're in a difficult quandary here about what we do, and I think we're in an ethical quandary, but I think that we can't get away from asking questions about where are we going to position ourselves, and to what extent are we using a process that is ineffective, potentially collusive, or to what extent are we involved in mitigating what might be a difficult process for young people. I'm going to move on from that debate and think about, okay, the other debate around is when we're thinking about safeguarding, whose role is it and who is stepping in and taking responsibility for young people when they cross borders. And we're seeing that in February 2022, the change went to the National Transfer Scheme became compulsory. So now young people, when they're identified, they go to different local authorities on a rota system. There has been increasing concern about the period between the child landing. We're thinking particularly here about children who are arriving in Kent on boats. Obviously, children come into the country in different ways. But there's concerns about the period between the child landing and being placed within a local authority, because this process means that the Home Office are taking responsibility for children for a period of time. But the Home Office have been saying there's no statutory responsibility, they don't have responsibility for the provision that's provided, and the local authorities have been saying, well, they're transient children, they haven't really officially come into being looked after within our local authority, and children are being a little bit political footballs in the middle of this. And we know there've been, I'm sure you might have seen in the media, you may have been involved in yourself in a number of concerns about the number of children going missing from hotels. Numbers are debated. But we're seeing that actually children are being accommodated outside of the looked after system, places them at increasing risk in terms of trying to manage them and provide them with robust social work services is very, very difficult. And that's been really supported in the High Court ruling in this July, where the Home Office ruled that this process of putting asylum-seeking children in hotels was unlawful because it just became routine. And that the decisions of Kent, which were done because of capacity issues and the number of challenges we know with placements, was in breach of the Children Act, really reinforcing for us actually the Children Act is still a powerful document. Childcare law, by which social workers are defined and work, is still a powerful tool that we can use in terms of our work with young people. So it's really important that we're staying up to date with case law. And we know that local authorities, in terms of the Associate Directors of Children's Services, are themselves pushing for new policies, new direction, acknowledging that actually there is much more we can do in terms of trying to meet the needs of unaccompanied young people. And of course, we have the Illegal Migration Act, which I won't go through in detail, but this is a significant piece of new legislation because it's saying if you come from what the government considers to be a legal route, that you claim for asylum will automatically be deemed inadmissible. There are very, very likely to be legal challenges to this as it comes into implementation. But again, there are some real concerns. This is the Children's Commissioner just this month, October the 19th, saying that it's really important that children are accommodated within local authority services rather than the Home Office, because it's really important that actually social work services, and that social work services are seen to do this, are the people who are taking the lead responsibility for this. So if we come back to what do young people say they want, because young people are at the middle of all this, and we're talking about politics and law, there are real human beings at the centre of this. They want safe places to live with access to education, healthcare networks, and they want to be able to make choices about that. They want social workers who engage with them, understand their aspirations, and act when needed. Support to tell their story in no time to people they trust. Trust takes time, and we know that's really complicated when you have to present your story to the Home Office immediately, either at the border or in your interview at a later time. Young people want us as social workers to understand how young people want to practice their culture in the way they choose, and to support them to learn about a culture in a new country. They want social workers who understand the local social care system, but are also up to date on the immigration process. Social workers are not immigration lawyers, are they? Very much not. Very complex area of work. But they want us to be engaged in that and to support, understand the processes that they're going through. Support to maintain links with transnational families. That's an area of work that we could certainly develop in social work. And we know lots of young people do stay in touch, although for some it's not safe or able to do that. Durable solutions. We come back to the idea of how we can support young people to maintain lives in the UK after they leave childhood. That's a very complex and challenging area, and is likely to become more challenging under the new auspices of the Illegal Migration Act. What we can see is, if we link that to the UNCRC triangle of rights, that if we're working on a rights basis, we're more likely to engage with what young people do want from us in services. So actually taking a rights-based approach can be really helpful and supportive in terms of thinking about what is it young people want from us as practitioners. It's obviously what they're saying to us, actually, we want you to help us enact our rights. So just to run through, I'm aware of the time, so I'll run through some good news. Let's get onto this. So there are examples of really resourceful, skilled, committed practice with children in care across every region of the world. And social works can be powerful, and they can have a real role to play when they're working with young people who cross borders. And young migrants continue to say that actually they really value people who are engaged in helping them to understand and realise their aspirations. Obviously, some of them are not going to be possible, but some of them are. Offering advice, guidance, emotional support and encouragement. We're talking about a relationship-based approach here, aren't we? In terms of this is what young people say that they value and that they like. So they want relationships where they feel welcomed, valued and supported, and in a context where actually you don't feel valued or welcomed when you come into the UK. Actually having somebody who does welcome you and value and listen to you can be actually hugely powerful. And engagement after potentially traumatic events, but we don't just automatically see young people as traumatized. Actually, if you're skilled, reflective, knowledgeable practitioners, can make a real difference to young people's resilience, their ability to act, their ability to recover from services. And the everyday acts of care can build relationships. And if you position yourself as an ally, in navigating asylum process, you share in those emotional shifts, actually can make a really significant difference for young people. So I'm not pretending that this will make certain decisions, or some of the things that happen to young migrants will kind of make that okay. Some of the decisions that social workers might want to make young people, they can't, because that is not within their power or authority. But that doesn't mean that social work can't have a role. And using communication and engagement skills are really key to that. So just go through. And actually, us as social workers, here's a social worker talking about how she learned to challenge what was happening in Home Office interviews at the border, as she's talking about working with young people at a port. So actually using the skills that we have in terms of our communication and engagement skills can make a difference for young people. And that we can challenge other professionals if we think that young people aren't being responded to in a way that we think is in their best interest. So finally, just run through, in terms of sustaining good practice, how might we do that as professionals? Yeah? We understand that relationships can make a difference. Engagement communication skills are really important. It's more than just a provision of services. Thinking about what durable relationships might mean for young people. I know that we're in a process, we're looking at potential deportation, but thinking about family connections, who are they living with, peers, carers, community, how are we building relationships that might sustain young people into the future? Taking a rights-based approach, using that language in practice, trying to move us away from ideas of worthiness and deservedness. Being aware of the legal context and making contact with legal representatives, questioning, challenging, asking questions when needed. And keep up to date, ask for training. There isn't sometimes a lot of it around. I know people are very busy. Be open to challenge, reflect on your perspectives. Ask yourself in your organisations and in your supervision, how are you thinking about young migrants? You know, what are the narratives? What are the ideas? And actually thinking about gender, age, sexuality, ethnicity, using some theoretical framework, thinking about power relations will help you to do this. Keep social work values at the centre of your work. If you hear excluding narratives, challenge them, ask questions about those things. And remember that the way we practice now, the policy doesn't have to define the professions. Nothing is ever beyond challenge. The way we're doing things right now is not the way we were doing things 20 years ago. Which isn't to say that was necessarily better, but remember, we can challenge and we can be part of change. And importantly, remember that actually this is a social work issue globally. So there are people across many, many nations who are struggling with these same issues. So connect, look out, get support, collectivity, share knowledge within your teams, between your organisations, within your organisations. Look up from what you're doing, from your policies, from your organisations, and look out. Actually, there's a lot of sustaining support and encouragement and knowledge that's available to everybody out there. Thank you. I'll hand back to Lucy.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was absolutely fascinating. A very topical subject given today's current climate, but the climate of everything going on over the last few years and probably up ahead too. I've heard your presentation or elements of your presentation before, but you always do something new, and I learn something new every time you present on your research findings. So thank you again. It's also great to see the voice of children really born out of your research. And I hope that this recording is disseminated far and wide so that people can really hear what you found these young people wanted. And it's also nice to have some hope for maybe what we can do in some ways, whether we're social workers or other child protection workers, police, health, and so on. I do have a couple of questions for you. And if it's all right with you, we'll move into the question element of this. The first question is, social workers, let's stick with social workers for this, but still have to work within the law. And they aren't immigration officers. How much can they really challenge what happens to young people if they really wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, yes, they are. And actually, but I think that definition, there's a quote actually that one of the social workers said in my research, which he clearly said, you know, we're not immigration officers, and it's our role to hold on to our social work values and our skills and our knowledge, and understand that that brings something particular. Yeah? And I think that rather than seeing, I think it's easy, and I've experienced it myself, as that kind of frustration with the fact that, unlike working with other children where we have ideas of permanency, for example, where we can go, social workers, you can go to the family court, you can, local authority, you can issue, you can issue proceedings, etc. You can act much more in order to achieve permanency. That can be very different when you're working with young people affected by the immigration system, where you can't give them leave to remain. You can't give them refugee status. It's absolutely not within your power and control. But that doesn't mean that you're therefore completely powerless. I think that what comes through in my research is that yes, you can challenge. Actually, you can be engaged with immigration lawyers. You can be knowledgeable about that and ask questions. You can go along with young people, and I know how busy people are to those interviews, or you can make sure that they have support to do that. You can sit in interviews at borders or with welfare interviews and challenge what's happening if you don't think people are being spoken to or treated, that the child's best interest is the primary concern. And I think you can be really clear about, okay, what is within our control as social workers, which is a lot, and use the legislation. The fact that you're working to childcare legislation in some ways is a benefit, because you are working to legislation which is very clearly saying the welfare of the child is paramount. So you have a legislative background. You don't have to work in that sense within your statutory organisation to immigration law in that sense, because you can say this is what we're working to. So it's understanding it, isn't it? Understanding the boundaries, understanding the difference, being confident enough to challenge when you can, and using the power and resources that you have. But I think the fact that you can't change everything, which absolutely we can't, doesn't mean that social workers are powerless.
And I think you did cover it towards the end of your presentation as well, about some of the things we can do, using, such as communication skills and so on within our knowledge base and so on. So it's really helpful.
Absolutely. And young people really value that. I mean, that's the really important thing. And sometimes we can get, we can forget that, because we can get a bit caught up in the fact that, oh, that's just, we're being a bit wishy-washy, saying it's really nice to sit down with somebody and have a cup of tea and you can just be nice to people. But actually, what research tells us and what theory tells us, actually, those things are still really powerful. Actually providing a young person with somebody who listens to them for the first time, or hears them, or supports them, or values them, or treats them as a human being in a context of when you're maybe being completely dehumanized by certain processes, is a really powerful thing to do. It won't solve everything. Doesn't mean we don't have to challenge and do other things, but we mustn't lose sight of the power of that.
A couple more questions. You talked about some of the gender differences. Could you say something about other identities like sexuality or religion?
Yes. So I think that what we always need to think about young migrants in terms of being a migrant is only part of who they are, and that's only because they've crossed a border, and we are defining them in terms of being a young migrant. We need to understand that young people have their own complex identities, and but we do respond, but that might affect both the migration process and how we respond to them. So we know, for example, that religion can be a really central, supportive religious faith. It can be really central to some young people's capacity to cope. It might be absolutely central to how they understand the world and their worldview, the decisions they're making. But it also can be a massive change when you move from a culture where maybe your religion is expressed and understood in one way into a UK culture where your religion is completely understood in another way. And young people are making senses, aren't they, about how they want to practice their religious faith and what they want to hold on to and what they want to move away from. And I'm just completing some research on sexuality or LGBT, including young people in gender identity, which I think is really showing up that that can be hugely problematic in terms of young people. We still know very little, and some of the decisions we might make, for example, young people are better off living with the other young people of their own culture, might be hugely problematic if you're a gay young man, for example. So we need to think very carefully about all aspects of young people's identity.
Very helpful, thank you. How can we effectively engage the local community in protecting migrant children in a political climate where immigration is seen as the problem facing the country?
Yeah, goodness, I wish I had the answer to that one. I mean, it is, and I think we have to first of all acknowledge that it is the massive problem, and that we have some very excluding narratives, is how I would think of it. Some ways of thinking that are very excluding. And social work at the moment is not, we're not engaging with communities necessarily very well. I think that we are, mainly because we're kind of preoccupied, we're very, very busy doing the statutory work that we need to do. I think that is work can do. Certainly think about residential services and educational support services. There is actually a lot of community support out there. Yeah. And young people can be really, I think we need to understand the communities in which young people are living, in terms of what services are available in terms of health and education, and also community groups. We need to think about how we support young people to make connections outside of the bubble, because often young migrants make a bubble with other young people, which tends to be quite gendered. So we have young men tend to make bubbles with other young men, and young women can be quite excluded from that. I think it's a real challenge, and I think it's important that we think about representations, that we speak positively, that we think about the messages we're putting out there as well. So we're pushing back against some of those excluding narratives. But it's a huge challenge, and it's not something social work can do by itself. It change kind of the national narrative.
Thank you for that. Rachel, could you say a little more about how different groups of migrants are seen differently? For example, those whom were more sympathetic, perhaps, than with others.
Yes. So if we think back to the situation in Ukraine is an example of that, and obviously the situation in Ukraine is horrendous for Ukrainians. So I'm in no way suggesting that we shouldn't be offering support and care for people who are living through that war. But there is a really clear pattern if you look at media representations and discussions about kind of innocence and worthiness and how Europe should be responding. If you look at the schemes that are set up, you look at the way the government set up schemes around supporting Ukrainian families to come, and how much quicker those routes were. So who gets safe passage and who doesn't get safe passage? Yeah. And what you see is that routes across Europe are much more readily available. And I'm not saying they're easy or weren't hugely problematic for people fleeing Ukraine, but they are much more, but they were put into existence rather than routes that for people coming up from African routes. Yeah. And we can't escape the fact that the majority of people living in Ukraine are white, and the majority of people trying to come across on boats are people of colour. And we see that kind of time and time again. And if you look at media representations, you can see often that when we want to see ideas about kind of threats and danger, it's often young men and young black men in groups who are presented as the danger and the threat. Whereas if we often see children, often girl children, often white girl children, presented as the kind of picture of innocence and vulnerability. So these are kind of consistent narratives, and there's quite a lot of research that backs that up. It's not just my perspective. And so that those narratives and those ideas are all around us, and we absorb them. They're in our heads, even if we don't choose them. And I think it's really important that we are critically reflecting on that. What difference would this make if this was somebody else, had a different identity?
Thank you. I've got one more question for you, but I'm going to read a comment in the chat as well, which said, thanks, Rachel, I think in response to your answering one of the previous questions. Indeed, the outfacing services have a challenging but vital role to play in bringing community to the task of protecting migrant children. Now, the last question, I think we're going to run out of time for any more. We've got about a minute, but it's okay if we run over a minute or two. The young people have some unrealistic aspirations for life in the UK. How do you suggest social workers, child protection workers manage this?
Yes, and I think the first thing I would say is that we need to understand that's okay. Yeah, and I know that might sound a bit strange, but I've certainly have worked services, and I've heard narratives where the idea of the grateful refugee child or the grateful refugee is one which says, you should be grateful for anything you should get. You shouldn't actually have aspirations or ambitions or want those things. And that young people are somehow being unreasonable if they want to have more money. And I've certainly worked with young people themselves who are really unhappy with maybe the amount of money they're getting from the local authority, or why can't they have a smartphone? Or we see that with all children who are living in the care system as well, don't we? But so I think the first thing to say is understand that it's part of maybe the reason that they've migrated and moved, that aspirations are sustaining. It's part of their age. Think about age and stage. So we understand that. And it's really important that we are honest and open and communicate clearly with young people about what's possible and what isn't possible and why not. And some of that we might agree with or not. So, for example, it's really, really difficult to get into university if you don't have, status in the UK. It was pretty much impossible unless you can. There comes kind of organisations that fund for that, but that's a very difficult position to take. So it's really important that we understand young people's aspirations, that we engage with those, we think about what's possible and what isn't, and then we have honest and clear conversations and discussions as part of our relationship-based work with young people. But the key thing is that we don't blame young people for having hopes and aspirations.
I think that's a nice place to end, actually. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your time today. You've been absolutely brilliant, really fascinating topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody for questions as well. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.